Tonight I'll be talking about the Ensoniq Mirage. This sampler, man, I have a kind of a love-hate relationship with the thing. On the one hand, this is one of the coolest bits of musical equipment out there. It's an 8-bit sampler from 1984. It has 2 bunks of 64K RAM, giving you 128K. It has, well, I've replaced it, but it normally would have a single-sided floppy disk, 3.5 inch there. It's got 8 tracks. Furthermore, each of those 8 tracks has its own filter. These filters are part of the thing that gives the Mirage a special sound. There were a few samplers that came out before this, but they were incredibly expensive. They're talking about like the Fairlight or the EMU emulator, whereas this was the first affordable sampler. All the ones before, they were quite a lot more expensive. Now this thing may not seem that affordable, to be honest, but apparently it was $1,700 new back in 1983, which I imagine you could have got a small car for the price of this, but if you really wanted a sampler, you could own one. The sound quality is very unique. I don't know any other sampler that really sounds like the Mirage or any bit of equipment. It sounds so dirty, so gnarly, really, really noisy. In 1984, buying the cheapest sampler on the market also meant you definitely had the worst sound quality, and I guess at the time that was kind of a negative for the Mirage. But now, in 2021, that kind of unique grit that this thing has is what makes it so desirable. So I got this a few years ago now, and I paid about £300 for it, which seemed a lot to me at the time. But I was checking on eBay just before going live, and you can pick one up now for between £500 and £1,000, so they are definitely going up in price. If someone offers you an Ensoniq Mirage, a good deal, I would definitely recommend taking it. It kind of sounds a bit like an Amiga Crunchy Pro Tracker sound. Let's play you some sounds. I didn't quite trust myself to prepare a complete track during this stream. You'll soon see why. It's very difficult to control with this interface. Track 1, we've got a breakbeat. As you can hear, that is really crunchy. There's also a high-pitched whine going through it. I'm not sure if all Mirages sound like that or if it's just my one. From what I can tell, they all kind of sound like that. Not every sample has the whine. This other breakbeat doesn't. I think it's effect of the sampling rate, the source material, and the filtering. Track 3 now. That's a little bass sound. As you can hear, it's super, super gritty. Track 4. Here you can start to hear some of the filtering aspects of the Mirage. That piano stab sounds fairly gritty, but if you listen closely, I've programmed in some delayed notes using the filter, and they sound like really liquidy. It's a really nice filter. Track 5 now.
Rinse selection.
Very gritty sounding ragga vocal.
Rinse selection.
That sample is from Jungle Frenzy. All the other samples are from Data File 1, except for this pad, which is also from Jungle Frenzy. If you listen to the high frequencies, you can hear the kind of crunchiness and the aliasing coming from the samples. This is an Alesis MMT8, which is a MIDI sequencer, which I've had since I was a student, and it's an old favourite of mine. This box here is a DBX163 compressor, and I've just got it tickling the output a little bit. To understand why the Mirage sounds as it does, you have to understand a little bit about sampling theory. The human ear is a bandwidth up to 20 kilohertz. So the Nyquist theorem says in order to capture that 20 kilohertz, you have to sample at 40 kilohertz. That's all fine. But you have to also filter the input and output sound to remove sampling artifacts. So when you sample, you have to filter everything over the bandwidth. So let's say we wanted to capture 20 kilohertz of audio range. We're sampling at 40 kilohertz. So we have to filter away all sounds above 20 kilohertz. Otherwise, the sampling will produce artifacts. And it's the same on the output as well. So when you're playing back at 40 kilohertz, you're getting all kinds of weird sounds between 20 and 40 kilohertz, which you may or may not be able to hear. If you're sampling at a lower sampling rate, you definitely can. So you need to filter on the output as well, all sounds from 20 kilohertz to 40 kilohertz, as an example. This will sample up to about 39 kilohertz. You don't get much sample time then. This thing only has two 64-byte banks, so you want to reduce the sampling rate to have longer samples. So you reduce the sampling rate. Now that means that you also have to adjust the input and output sampling filters to match your new sample rate. The Mirage does have input and output sampling filters. Because this is such a low level, close to the metal machine, you can actually set what those filters are. So you can either have loads of aliasing, no aliasing, or you can tune it in between. But it always seems like no matter how much you tune those sampling rates and those filter frequencies, it always seems to sound amazingly gritty.
Rinse selection. Rinse selection. Rinse selection. Selection.
NE7 says the drums have a lovely early 90s alternate vibe. Great for rave. Yeah, it does sound very rave, doesn't it? What I've noticed a lot of people doing on YouTube is sampling their drums into this and then sampling the output of the Mirage to put into some DAW or other sampler. But the problem is, well, there's two problems. First of all, in this jam, you'll notice every sample sounds like that, sounds grungy and lo-fi. Now, that's all well and good, but as I was doing this, I sort of thought, you know, it'd be quite nice if some of the sounds weren't so grungy and lo-fi. It would be nice if some of them sounded hi-fi as a contrast. As such, I wouldn't recommend the Ensoniq Mirage as your only sampler. I think it's a really good second sampler, either for drums, or I think pads sound really good with the aliasing. If you use the Mirage for everything, it's a little bit overwhelming, in my opinion. The other negative is this interface here. So you have an incredibly low level and quite complex sampler, which you're controlling with this dual 7-segment LED display. I mean, I'm all for low level, and I love stuff like this, but it's just a little bit too much for me. All you've got here is parameter value up, down. You've got a numeric keypad. You've got some buttons for saving and loading, right? What you have to do is you either have to remember the code for every parameter, or you have this cheat sheet, which I've printed out from the internet, but from what I understand, it was supplied with the original Mirage. The way this is architected is you've got two banks of samples. You've got a lower half and an upper half. I'm using an operating system for the Mirage, which is called MASOS, Mirage Advanced Sampling Operating System. There's actually 3 operating systems you can get for the Mirage. There's a simpler one, and there's one which uses the filters, and it's more like a synthesizer type operating system. For sampling, I found this Mirage Advanced Sampling Operating System the best way to go. So on this operating system, in the lower half, you can have 8 samples, and in the upper half, you can also have 8 samples, which gives you 16 samples in total, except that there's not much sample memory on this thing, so you're more limited by sample rate than the number of samples that you can have. In fact, this tune that I've been demoing, it only has 6 samples, which is quite low for me. I think because it sounds so gritty, that kind of adds to the richness, so you can get away with having less samples. Right, first sample is the piano. Now, I've set this up to be velocity sensitive. If I press less hard, you'll get a filtered piano. Which is a brilliant feature. The drawback to that is every channel has a filter, but you can only set it globally for the lower half and globally for the upper half. So all your lower half samples have to have the same filter envelope, and all your upper half samples have its own single filter envelope. That seemed like a limitation to me, but in producing this jam, I didn't really seem to run into too many problems. I could make it work.
Rinse selection.
Right, there's your rinsing selections. And I've also done a velocity sensitive filter, so quieter sounds are more heavily filtered. And you can hear, as it's more filtered, the aliasing artifacts in the top end get filtered away. Then we've got the lovely pad. At the end of the sample, I've got an envelope during the release phase, which gradually takes away the cutoff, which gives you that nice effect at the end of the sound. That tail, that filtered tail, is coming from the Mirage. That's not in the original sample. It's being added by the built-in filters. So those are 3 out of the 8 samples in the lower half. I could have sampled another 5, but I didn't. Let's do the upper keyboard half samples now. So I've got this break, which kind of has a whine going on in the background. I don't know why that sample has it and none of the other ones. But I've made this experience with the Mirage before. Some of the sounds weirdly whine. Now for the bass. You can hear it's looping at the end. I didn't do an amazing job of getting that loop tight. It is a bit annoying to do that on the Mirage, to trim your loops nicely. And the final sample is... So I'm going to go and do some sampling now. I'm going to start with some drums. We're going to do the 0G data file. I'm going to select the lower half, sample 1. Now we have to adjust the sampling frequency. So we press the parameter button. Sampling frequency is number 73. That's the parameter for sampling frequency. I'm reading that from this cheat sheet here. At the moment, that is set to 80, which is 12.5 kilohertz. Let's increase that a bit. Let's make it 15 kilohertz. The nearest rate to that is 67, which is 14.9 kilohertz. We're still not done. We have to set the next parameter now, which is the input filter frequency. Now, I've set this as high as possible because I wanted to get all of the lovely aliasing artifacts on the sound. Maybe, however, we should attempt to get the best sound quality, so we're doing 15 kilohertz, so that means the Nyquist rate, there's a handy table in the manual I'm reading this from, by the way. Nyquist rate is half that, which is 7.5 kilohertz. So then I look up against the filter. 7.5 kilohertz is a setting of 81 on the filter. Still not done. We have to set the input gain. There's two settings that can be microphone or line, and I've got it set to line. I have actually tried the microphone setting. It sounds really nice. It sounds a bit more warm and distorted when you use that. Some samplers, when you go into microphone mode, it's a bit too much, but on this it just gives a sort of rounded, quite nice sounding distortion. But anyway, I've got it on line mode. Then we have to set the sampling threshold. Here it's set to 8. I'm going to just leave it at 8. The last parameter we set before sampling, 77, is whether we want user multi-sampling. Now, for the track that I've been playing to you, I had user multi-sampling set to on, as you can see. To demonstrate it to you, I'm actually going to switch it off because it will then be easier to play back the sample afterwards. With this operating system, you actually set the sample location in memory, so you can totally overwrite samples you've already recorded if you're not careful. You really have to watch where you're sampling things into. If you have user multi-sampling off, it just allows you to have one sample on the lower and one sample on the upper, but at least you're not going to break anything and it will all be nice and easy. Now we want to do the sampling. We press the sample button. We want to do lower half. Sample lower half. Now what this is a level display. When I play back the sample, the middle bar shows when we've hit the trigger level and the upper shows when it's clipping. So basically it's really hard to not have it clip, and actually a bit of clipping does tend to make it sound a bit better, so I'm going to actually dial in a bit more. Maybe like there, and then you press enter and it's waiting for your sample to go above the threshold. I waited a little too long. Let's do that again. Right, that sample's done. SF means sample finished, I think. Well, you can hear there's noise at the end there. Let's set the filter release time to 0 so that we can cut off the end a bit sharper. Filter release is 44. I'm going to set that to 0. We can also set the amplitude release to 0. That's 54. I hope you're all getting a very good flavour of how it is to operate the Mirage in reality, doing an actual track. I think you can hear the grit that the Mirage is adding. It definitely sounds better coming from the Mirage than the original sample. I hope you would all agree with that. I'm going to set this beat to loop. We want to switch looping on, which is parameter 65, loop on. We want to set the loop start to the start of the sample, which is 0. You can't bang 0 into this. This number key is only for the parameters. For the value, you have to use this control. Now we need to set the loop end. We're getting closer to the loop point though. Nearly. Okay. That's looping quite nicely. There we go. Okay, original Mirage. It's quite different, isn't it? I really like the effect. And now we can start messing around a bit with some of the filters. Okay, that's very filtered. Got to be aware, if you're going to get a Mirage, you're going to be poking this interface quite a lot. People do say Chakka's a complicated gun stick. This is much more complicated than a tracker. I want to show you the pads, because I think pads are a really good place where this Mirage sound really works. So using Jungle Frenzy, let's go to the pad section. Right, got the sample queued up. Sample on the upper half this time. Test the level. It's going a bit too high there. Maybe that. I mean, I like to have a bit of clipping, but not crazy. I think that'll do. Right, let's sample. Done that sample. Let's play it back. You hear what it's done. It's really dirty. We can try and clean it up a bit by using the filter. I mean, it's sounding a lot more like the original now. I mean, it sounds pretty smooth once you filter it, but I'd rather turn the filtering off and have like all the artifacts. So we've got a bit of resonance dialed in. Let's switch the resonance off. There's a lot of resonance now. Well, that's sounding really quite interesting now. I'm going to add a bit of release time. And it immediately makes it sound really old and really rave. And that really is the Mirage in a nutshell. I mean, not accurate to the original sample. The filters sound amazing. They legitimately are really good filters. It's noisy, it's gritty, it's hard to control, but it sounds absolutely beautiful. I don't know anything like it. It's genuinely a unique piece of gear, that's for sure. Take care, guys, and have a good one.